All right. Hello and welcome to our lecture on the Harlem Renaissance. This is where we're really going to look at what a lot of historians have come to refer to as the era of the New Negro. And this was a term that was coined by Elaine Locke, who we'll talk about in a little bit. Now, I just want to remind you of what we talked about before, kind of the era after Reconstruction, or the Jim Crow era, right? We had the Civil War amendments that were passed in the in the mid 1800s after the Civil War, the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment, ending slavery, kind of, allowing for birthright citizenship and allowing universal male suffrage. All men can now vote. But then the repercussions of that with the Jim Crow laws, or the Black Codes, we saw the restrictions on voting in particular, as well as many other areas of life, including limitations on political freedoms, economic freedoms, and social freedoms. So keep that in mind as we talk about the Harlem Renaissance and this era of the New Negro in the 1920s. So the definition of the Harlem Renaissance, kind of the what, the who, and the why is this important. So the what of the Harlem Renaissance that you need to understand is that it's an increase in African-American art, music, literature, and just Black culture in general. This is really a celebration of African-American culture by African Americans. Harlem is actually a neighborhood in New York, on the island of New York. So you can see where my cursor is right here in this green color. That's Harlem. And it became home to educated African Americans and kind of a middle class group of African Americans in the 1920s. The Who was primarily artists. Many of the contributors, many of these artists lived through the upheavals of that era I was just talking about, right? Most of them have lived through Jim Crow and kind of gaining of the post-Civil War rights, and lived through this time period of gaining some rights and then losing them once Reconstruction ended. Now, the why is it important is because this time period really gives African Americans an opportunity to create their own identity. It gives African Americans the ability to celebrate their contributions and their unique history as part of the history of the United States. And it's history as told by their own community, not told by those who had enslaved them, or not told by outsiders. All right, so we need to talk a little bit about some of the pioneers, some of the thinkers and leaders that led up to the 1920s. So the first one that I have here is Booker T. Washington. Booker T. Washington was born a Southern slave. He had a Black mother and a white father, and he was freed by Emancipation Proclamation during the Civil War and then ultimately with the 13th Amendment. And so it's important to understand that that's his background, that he was born into slavery. Now, his ideas around education were pretty specific here. He believed that we, as a culture, as a society, need to teach African Americans vocational skills or job skills, right? He's argued that as African Americans contribute positively to society, that whites would gradually come to recognize their contributions. A lot of people felt that this was really kind of an accommodator. So you can see, I'm going to move this a little bit so that you can see the key terms down here. A lot of people saw Booker T. Washington as an accommodator. They believed that he was urging Blacks to accept some discrimination for a time and elevate themselves through hard work. So he wasn't demanding enough change quickly enough. Here's a quote from him. "The world cares very little about what a man or woman knows. It is what a man or woman is able to do that counts." So again, thinking about those vocational skills or those job skills that he argued was the best way for African Americans to move up in society. Okay, and our next pioneer that I want to mention is W.E.B. Du Bois. W.E.B. Du Bois was different than Booker T. Washington in that he was born into an upper middle class neighborhood. So he didn't see the same type of racism or experience the same early life and childhood that Booker T. Washington had. He truly believed in education. He argued for a liberal arts education, kind of this idea of an all-around education. He said that we need to teach African Americans to question and challenge white people in society, that will ultimately lead to respect from white society. He also argued that some segregation is economically beneficial. He argued that African Americans relying on themselves and not white society was a really important part of empowering African Americans. So there's a quote here. There is in this world no such force as the force of a person determined to rise. The human soul cannot be permanently chained. And so again, kind of thinking more about the soul and the mind as the way to create change and make change. And then Alain Locke, this is who I mentioned at the beginning. Alain Locke came from a long line of well-educated African Americans. He was really kind of that example that W.E.B. Du Bois wanted. And his ideas about education was that art and cultural accomplishments could really transform the African American identity. And he's the one who coined the term the new Negro. He popularized this idea. He argued that the new Negro is somebody who is self-sufficient, self-respecting, educated, and politically and economically empowered. So what does that mean? Well, self-sufficient means that they are sufficient on their own. They're self-sufficient. They don't rely on white society. Okay, and so this also goes back to that idea that some segregation is economically beneficial, that Blacks are able to rely on themselves. They're self-sufficient within their own communities. They're also self-respecting. They respect their identity and their culture and their history. They are proud of what they've accomplished and what they've gone through, understanding that the past is not something to be embarrassed about, but rather something to be celebrated, something to be respected. Educated, obviously, going to school, getting an education. And then this is the key, politically and economically empowered. Again, not being dependent upon white society. The new Negro is a Black person who practices their voting rights, who can own their own business, who again is not just having the ability to vote, which was granted for men by the 15th Amendment, but actually going out and voting. That's somebody who's politically empowered, somebody who's economically empowered, somebody is a person who has a job that they want to have, not because it's what society says they have to have. Okay, and so these are the characteristics of the new Negro as kind of popularized by Alain Locke. He really believed that Blacks could gain cultural pride in their past and their present, that they could establish their own culture and not have a culture that's been placed upon them by outsiders. And so we really see this come about through the Harlem Renaissance. All right, so during the Harlem Renaissance, we see this rise of cultural identity. Now, this happens for a couple of reasons, but the first one is the Great Migration. So the Great Migration is movement of people. Okay, there was a massive migration north between 1914 and 1920. This was primarily Black people leaving the South in search of economic opportunities. If you remember, World War I is during this time. So from 1914 to 1918 is World War I. So American soldiers are leaving and going to fight over in Europe during this time, which means that there's jobs available in the North. During this time period, between 300,000 to 500,000 African Americans left the South. And they moved to these northern cities where they were trying to find jobs. They were leaving the violence of the South and looking for these economic opportunities that were available because so many male soldiers were leaving their jobs in the North in order to go fight. And so this allowed for the jobs to be open for these Black workers. However, even though there were jobs, it's important that you understand that while there was violence in the South and open hostile racism in the South, it wasn't as if the northern cities were waiting with open arms to welcome all of these migrants, particularly Black migrants from the South. And so they still faced racism in the North and often had to settle for low-paying jobs. Because of this migration, one of the places where many people settled was Harlem, and this really helps create the Harlem Renaissance and helps create this cultural identity. The community in Harlem was fueled by creativity and this cultural exploration. You had approximately 500,000 people packed into 3 square miles in this small neighborhood in New York City. There was this opportunity for art like there had never been before. And again, by art created by Black people telling their own story. They were creating their own identity. One of the ways they did this was through music, particularly through jazz. Louis Armstrong, Billie Holiday, and Duke Ellington are pictured here for you, but also Count Basie and numerous others, Bessie Smith, were famous during this time as singers and musicians. Often one of the hottest places to go was the Cotton Club, which in and of itself is we could spend a whole semester just studying kind of the politics around the Cotton Club. So the Cotton Club was modeled like a Southern plantation. This is in New York City. And while Black people worked there and performed there, only white people were allowed to actually be patrons there. They were the only ones who were allowed to be in the audience. But the Cotton Club was kind of the most exclusive club that featured a lot of these artists throughout the 1920s. We also saw the rise of literature and poetry during this time. Artists like Langston Hughes and Countee Cullen or Claude McKay, Zora Neale Hurston, all of these artists really had this explosion telling their stories during this time. I'm going to have you listen to a poem by Claude McKay called If We Must Die.
Must die, let it not be like hogs hunted and penned in an inglorious spot, while round us bark the mad and hungry dogs making their mock at our cursed lot. If we must die, oh, let us nobly die, so that our precious blood may not be shed in vain. Then even the monsters we defy shall be constrained to honor us though dead. O kinsmen, we must meet the common foe. Though far outnumbered, let us show brave, and for their 1,000 blows deal one death blow. What though before us lies the open grave? Like men we'll face the murderous, cowardly pack, pressed to the wall, dying, but fighting back.
Every time I hear that poem, I just get chills. It's so powerful. And so a lot of this poetry came out of that Harlem Renaissance, right? This ability in this era where African Americans were able to tell their own stories. Okay. We also saw it through painting. Aaron Douglas and Jacob Lawrence were painting pictures of life as they saw it. Again, not what outsiders were saying life was like for Black people, but what the Black community was actually saying, this is who we are. This is what our life is like. And so we saw art during this time just explode across the country. The other reality for this, though, is as Blacks began to become more well-known and more educated and have more of a voice, the reality is we also saw racial tension grow during this time. So there were riots and racial violence kind of throughout the United States. White servicemen were returning home after World War II. So again, the Harlem Renaissance is during the 1920s. So in World War I ends in 1918. So as soldiers are making their way home, they're coming home and they're finding that their jobs have been taken over by Black men and also by new immigrants. And so this leads to riots and racial violence. There's the summer of 1919 is often referred to as the Red Summer. There were 83 lynchings in the South in 1919 alone. There were race riots in Washington, D.C., Knoxville, Tennessee, Longview, Texas, Phillips County, Arkansas, Omaha, Nebraska, and there was a full week of rioting in Chicago. This is just in the summer of 1919. In Chicago, there was a Black teenager, 17-year-old Eugene Williams, who was out swimming in the lake and had crossed over the unofficial segregation boundary. Some young white men began throwing stones at him. He was hit in the head and ultimately drowned. The Black community was incredibly upset that the police refused to arrest the white man that eyewitnesses identified as causing the drowning, and riots broke out for a full week. There were riots happening throughout the city of Chicago, particularly in the South Side, where it was predominantly African Americans who lived. But it wasn't just in Chicago in 1919. Tulsa, Oklahoma in 1921. There was an area of Tulsa in Oklahoma known as Greenwood District. This is sometimes called Black Wall Street. This was some of the most economically successful African Americans in the United States lived here. They had luxurious homes with indoor plumbing. There were excellent schools for the Black kids in the community. In 1921, a white woman accused a Black man of rape, and violence broke out. In 2 days, 35 city blocks were burned to the ground. 300 people were killed and 800 people were injured. After the riots ended, Tulsa created the Tulsa Race Riot Commission. This was formed in a response to the riots. This commission recommended reparations, which are payments for damages for people who lost their property, and economic revitalization for Greenwood. So let's build up the economy of Greenwood. However, this never happened. So we see this example of the Black community being successful, and then again, just the burning to the ground of the Black community. Now, it wasn't just that Blacks had a voice, but there was a lot of change in the 1920s. The other reality that was happening during this time is there were a lot of new immigrants that were coming into the United States in the early 1900s. So this chart, you can see the Northern and Western Europeans. So that's that's red here. You can see from 1880 into 1890, primarily it's Northern and Western Europeans. And so these are people from England and Germany and Ireland, okay, kind of the area of Europe that was acceptable. However, we see a shift. Look at this, beginning at the late 1800s to now all of a sudden we have Southern and Eastern Europeans coming. So people from Italy, people from Eastern Europe are coming and escaping their World War I, first of all, and just the empires and the violence in the empires that are existing. There's also a lot of Jewish people that are coming over from Europe during this time. And so we see a shift in the immigrant population and people who are fleeing World War I. And so this is also bringing about that racial tension, not just African Americans who are finding their voice and declaring their kind of culture to be their own, but we also see the shift in immigration happening at the same time, which is adding to that racial tension from white people toward all others. This really led to a more militant spirit. Okay, so when I say militant here, I mean what I mean is an aggressive, somebody who's aggressive in support of political or social cause. Okay, so we see African Americans much more upset at the lack of equality. NAACP membership grew big time in the 1920s. NAACP stands for the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. And this was a legal organization to support African Americans. However, it wasn't just a militant spirit among African Americans, but also we see the backlash. We see a new militant spirit or a revival of the militant spirit from white people as well. The KKK or the Ku Klux Klan flourished in the 1920s. As African Americans gained more social power, membership in the Klan also grew. White society was fighting the news story that African Americans were creating. Okay, so African Americans were trying to switch the stereotype and say we're no longer these uneducated, poor people who need help and who are helpless and can't take care of themselves, but rather we are politically and economically empowered. We are self-sufficient, we are self-respecting, and we are educated, right? That new Negro. Well, the KKK came along to fight that as well. And you can see it's not just men. These are men marching. This is the capital, Washington, D.C. They had a march on September 13th, 1926. You can see, look at how many people are marching in our nation's capital. Over here, this picture is from Denver, Colorado. So it's important that you understand the Klan was not just active in the South, but across the United States, with men and women and families becoming part of the Klan. Ultimately, the new Negro's legacy. So what did kind of the Harlem Renaissance and this new Negro, what was their legacy? This created a new Black identity. As African Americans gained cultural importance in American history and even the rest of the world. I was telling you before, there's kind of this stereotype of the African American, somebody as undereducated peasants, right? They're incapable of independence. That's what this image here represents. Okay, this complicates, the new Negro complicates that traditional narrative. It's now showing us a picture of educated young men who are able to take care of themselves, and women as well. And the militant spirit and kind of the questioning how to achieve equality took a shift. An example of this is Marcus Garvey. He's pictured here on the right-hand side. Marcus Garvey was actually born in Jamaica, but immigrated here to the United States, and he really stressed Black economic self-determination and unity among Black communities. So it wasn't just African Americans, but anybody, Cubans and Jamaicans and Dominicans and Africans, right? The Black community that they needed to unite. He preached Black nationalism, that was pride and devotion to one's nation or people group. So in this case, Marcus Garvey, this educated man, is preaching a nationalism to Black people. And he argued that the only way for Black people to be free was to escape control by whites. And so he had what was called the Back to Africa movement. And he even went so far as to buy a shipping company to transport African Americans back to Africa, and founded what becomes Liberia. And to this day, that's still a country in Africa. And then the future implications. The Harlem Renaissance provides a reference point for what becomes the civil rights movement. It creates an understanding of a common identity for Black people. It creates kind of this role model, right, of what educated Black people could look like. Again, the new Negro, somebody who's self-sufficient, self-respecting, educated, and politically and economically empowered. And it creates that common understanding and helps Blacks and whites see what this can look like. So this provides a model of a self-determined, independent African American, provides the foundation of an increasingly dissatisfied and disenfranchised community that after the 1920s, we enter into the Great Depression and then World War II. But as soon as we get through those kind of worldwide episodes, those worldwide crises, we see the rise of the civil rights movement in the 1950s and 60s as pictured here. Black men claiming, I am a man. Blacks marching for equal education, voting rights, rights to jobs, and all of this really, the Harlem Renaissance helps provide the foundation. Please let me know if you have any questions. That's the end of our lecture today. You can find my works cited slide on your note-taking guide. If you have any questions, be sure you email me or visit me in office hours. I hope you have a wonderful day. Thank you for listening.